Pod SaaS, where we're putting the SaaS back in sassy. Sponsored by LeadrPro, where you can book demos with target customers on demand and fill your sales pipeline instantly.
Today we got Tyler from LeadrPro. And LeadrPro is a SaaS product for funeral homes, cremation centers. How would you define it? What would you call it?
So yeah, Parting Pro is technology in the death care space. So we call it death care tech, I guess. What Parting Pro does is creates the best death care experience. So we allow families to arrange and select services, pay for those services, and complete paperwork, all without actually like having to sit with a funeral director or go into a funeral home. If you're looking for like kind of like the VC pitch, it's the Shopify for funeral homes.
I've been excited to have this conversation with you because it's such an interesting space. And like, we're kind of like used to like SaaS products typically selling into like enterprise, companies and more like corporate, like, solving for like customer success or like sales or marketing optimization kind of stuff like that. But this is like the death care space. Like how did you get into this space, first of all? And then maybe even starting before then, like what was your background before you started Parting Pro? And then just, I guess, like from there, maybe walk us through like how you got the idea for the business.
Death care is definitely probably one of the most unsexiest verticals you can be in. No one likes to think about death. So just to give you a quick background, so I graduated a while ago from college, and I actually directly entered the startup world. So Parting Pro, which is 25 people now, is actually the largest company I've ever worked for. So my background is actually in online marketing. So I grew up figuring out just all the ways of generating online traffic, PPC, SEO, SEM, email. And I was essentially just arbitraging that traffic for advertisers who are willing to buy that, right? For products, it didn't really matter the product because I was in the middle just trying to generate traffic and sell it. The way it came about is kind of more of a typical, there had to be a better way type of story. My grandmother passed away in late 2014. And, like any...
Sorry to hear that.
Oh, thank you. And like any family in that situation, we all had the sadness and the grief and all the emotions and all the legal issues and all that stuff that you have to go through when someone passes away, but being the tech person of the family, I was like, I'm going to help figure this out, handle some of the arrangements for my family, because, if I left my parents up to it, what they were going to do is they were going to, get in the phone book and call different places and have to visit these funeral homes in person and, basically trying to navigate not getting ripped off, but not really having the resources to actually do that, because they're not, ones to immediately think to use the internet. However, my mom listens to everything I do, so she'll probably listen to this. They've gotten much better at it, but lo and behold, like here I was, the tech guy, a few days later, actually just calling and visiting in person a bunch of funeral homes, trying to navigate not getting ripped off. And the reason that is because there just wasn't anything out there that made it easy. There was no funerals.com to help make this situation like simple.
Yeah, the idea like there's got to be a better way. Like my first startup was an online tuxedo rental business, and like that was like with a couple of buddies of mine from high school, and the original idea was like doing custom suits, and then one of them like had mentioned, well, there's a few other custom suit companies out there already doing it online and digitally, but then he brought up the idea of like tuxedo rentals, and I had just gotten married, and I was like, remember that experience too, similar to kind of what you're talking about. But it's like going through that real life experience and then realizing that there's got to be a better way. Um, Makes a ton of sense. Like walk me through, I guess, like how you made that decision. Obviously, it's like when you start any venture, it's a pretty big investment of not just time and money, but it's a risk, right? To jump and make that leap forward in faith that you're building something that's going to be sustainable from whatever it is that you were doing before. And I'd love to know a little bit about like that decade long experience of, when you're just like generating like paid traffic. Um, that had to probably be somewhat comfortable for you. And then how do you make that decision to become like, I'm going to enter the death care space? It's like, what I mean? Like, I'm curious as like what the psychology was behind that motivation for you. And was there like a research phase or like, how did you figure out that there was a real opportunity here?
There should have been more of a research phase. I think we kind of jumped head first into it. Originally, the idea that we created was parting.com, not parting pro, but parting.com was supposed to be this hotels.com of the funeral industry, right? The issue that I had as a consumer was there wasn't a lot of information out there. Most websites were generic. Like I said, I had to call multiple funeral homes just to get any type of information about understanding pricing or what I wanted to do. And so originally I thought, well, this is a perfect fit. I can create traffic for people who don't know how to advertise online. And I could create like a, marketplace where you have advertisers on one side and you have consumers on the other, and just trying to match that, right? Like that felt like a perfect segue into what I was doing into, this new business venture. What you realize though, is that when you're trying to build, let's say the hotels.com of the funeral industry, like you would want all your major hotel chains and something on some type of reservation or booking system or something on the other end, right? There needs to be a technical infrastructure on the other side of that marketplace. Otherwise, you're trying to connect to nothing, or you're trying to create a bridge that connects, on one side has this connection to this like whole tech side, and on the other side, they're still trying to get you to fax and talk on the phone. So that was one thing. And then another thing is, our customer, we were approaching it from a consumer side, and our customer was actually the funeral home, right? So our focus was trying to create the best consumer experience possible. While on the other side of it, we're like, hey, funeral home, we just sent you a bunch of leads. Can you give us money? Right. So we were a little bit misaligned in who our actual customer was, who we were building for. And when the decision came, like, are we doing what's ultimately best for the consumer? Are we doing what's ultimately best for the funeral home? We would always side with the consumer, because that's kind of how our product approach was. So, we had to make that iteration and make that switch to actually creating a SaaS that kind of solved all the issues that we saw in why the first iteration of our company didn't work. And there's also a few other, market things that were coming up. In the United States, cremations were on the rise. For the first time in like 2 years ago, I think was the first time cremations were 51% of all dispositions. So, in all the other rest of the world, though, it's like 70 or 80% cremation rate. But because of that, you took a lot of the elements out of a burial, which are, some of the questions that you need to figure out where you're going to bury the person or what have you. And so we were able to take not only the trend in that, but also the trends in what we were seeing in terms of not having some type of infrastructure. And that's how Parting Pro was kind of built.
Like, how do you be flexible enough to be like, what we're doing is not working? And when do you come to that realization? And then, how do you make that decision, to make that pivot? And what are the emotions kind of going through your mind as well as your co-founder's mind, if, like as you're going through it and like realizing that this first iteration is not working?
It was good and bad, because, from an online marketing sense, I think most online marketers would believe that any marketing could sell anything. Right. And I think part of that was there, but ultimately it's surrounding yourself with people that know what they're talking about. So we had investors who were like, I think you need to pivot and create software for the funeral home, engage that side, create like a market network, and create a SaaS for the funeral home and engage the right customer. Because what we were doing, like I said, is we were building for one group, but actually ultimately trying to make money from another. So, I think the influence of our investors and having and surrounding yourself with the right people was a huge influence in making sure that we were on the right path to growing a real company.
As a founder, you wear a ton of hats, right? So like, what are some of the hats that you've worn that you didn't expect to, maybe, and that you ended up enjoying, or some of the hats that you had to wear that you detested wearing? um, I think a lot of like, let's just imagine like there's a lot of potential founders out there kind of like listening to this, and um, or they're kind of like earlier than you guys are, and they're like in this phase of just scrambling. Like, what would you provide in terms of like your expertise, kind of like your background in having gone through that already, and sharing just some of those experiences?
I've always been comfortable marketing and putting content out there and looking at it on a very massive scale, right? Like you send out 1 million emails, you have this open rate, you have this click rate, and it's all a funnel, right? But one of the things that, when starting Parting Pro, we ultimately had to pick up the phone and, cold call people. I had never had that type of experience. I would not say I was comfortable on the phone, and originally I would say I was actually terrified. It was terrifying for me to like pick up the phone. With one of my other co-founders, Will, we would, sit in the garage. So we actually started in the garage, but, we would have this list of 10 people and we were tasked with calling each day, and it would take us hours to, pick up the phone, dial the number. And ultimately it was funny because we were hoping that the DM that we were trying to contact wasn't available so that we could just like hang up and get off the phone and like check it off. Right. However, now like I would pay to get in front of people to pitch our product and to talk to them and like try to sell our product. Right. But at the time, I was like, I'm not a salesperson. We would hire salespeople to do that. But as a founder, you're never going to be able to, specialize like that right away. You're going to have to wear those hats. You're going to have to do all of that. And I think one of the most challenging things about starting a startup, besides all the nuances of your own specific industry, is, really just getting comfortable knowing that you don't know anything and that you're not experienced with anything, right? Every day as founders, we're like faced with these problems for the first time. And it's really on us to figure them out because no one else is going to do it if it's your company. So, one piece of advice that I've received from, two advisors who are CEOs of unicorns, independently, right? They're first time founders, but they independently gave me this advice is, what they ultimately said is no one knows what they're doing. Like really no one has any idea, but really what you have to do is you have to get confident and comfortable in the fact that you don't know, but that you can navigate these uncharted waters and that you'll be able to get out of them, with minimal damage on the other side. So you get confident, not necessarily in knowing everything, but knowing that you can get out of the situation and problem solve confidently. So I think that's what I've learned.
That's really good advice. Yeah, I think that's really great advice to share with people. I think like a lot of the times the misconception is that, right? It's like, oh, you're the CEO of XYZ or you're the founder of XYZ, and they just assume that you've gone through this experience. But it's like almost, every startup is unique in their own journey and its own set of problems, right? Like nothing is cookie cutter to be put into any other scenario. Like founder of XYZ unicorn isn't necessarily going to be able to, you know, um, become the CEO of Parting Pro, for example, and then solve all the problems, right? So it's all going to be brand new for that individual as well. They may have a little bit shorter, period of like solving certain things, but they're still going to have to figure out brand new. So I think that proves, yeah, that proves very true for a lot of founders. What would you say like was, one of the takeaways from doing that uncomfortable exercise? Because I'm a strong believer of like, yeah, you have to pick up the phone. You kind of have to figure out your playbook first before anybody else can, right? It's like, what did you learn from picking up the phone, and how has that kind of like I think shaped you as a CEO, as a leader now, right? Like you have a team of 25. I feel like when you get to that stage too, it's more about managing people and personalities, but again, like having the confidence to be able to speak about it because you've already gone through the experience. So you can set benchmarks. You can understand like what their complaints are, or if they're not succeeding, understand why they're not being successful. When they should be, that kind of stuff. Like you only know that after going through it. So curious as to like, what you took away from that experience. And even though you maybe hated it, like, but like, yeah, did you learn to love it later on? Or I mean, like, how did that go?
I wouldn't say that I love it, uh, but I'm definitely more comfortable with it. And I think, that was probably one of the biggest things that would have scared me before, like as starting the company, like being able to cold call and do like a sales and do a demo and all of that. And, after getting through that, you realize like, if I can do this, all the other things that I have to do, customer success or, customer support or, even pitching like VCs became a lot easier once I was able to, kind of tackle something that was completely out of my comfort zone. Right. So all these other things were a lot easier in comparison, right? And so I think that helped build the confidence that like, yeah, we could come across these problems and we could still figure out a way to get ourselves out of them. And
Now that you're managing a team of 25 people, what do you feel like the changes in your daily challenges are from, say, 2 years ago to now?
you do a lot more meetings. You sit on Zoom a lot more now. I mean, we're a fully remote company, so Zoom meetings was always something that we did, but before it would be a Zoom meeting, and then I would do a bunch of like actual like work. Like everything is work, but I mean, you would sit there and you would be in the spreadsheets and you would be in the creating a creating a creative that you're going to push out on one of your social channels or something like that. But now, you're just managing to make sure that as a collective, your team are hitting their KPIs or they're accomplishing their goals, and you're basically sitting there trying to support them versus trying to accomplish everything on your own, right? So one, you have to kind of hire people that you can trust. So that's a big one. And then two, getting comfortable knowing that, as a leader, as someone who's like managing others, that your KPI or your personal goal is not necessarily how much work output you're doing in that day, but more on like what you're able to help the people that you're managing produce.
Is it natural for you to kind of be a leader, or like, do you defer to finding advice outside of that? Do you have a network that you go to? Do you seek mentors?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I always look towards investors, advisors, network to help solve problems. I realize like the smarter and the more helpful of a network you have, it's not necessarily that you wouldn't come to those answers yourself, but you would take less turns on the path of actually ultimately getting to the right answer. So I would say that's a big one. But I would say that, yeah, I wouldn't say I'm naturally a great manager or anything, but like anything else, it takes work and understanding of how to make things effective. And I'm working on it and trying to do the best that I can. Kind of just like everything else, like cold calling or marketing or whatever other hat I was wearing that I was not necessarily doing.
On this journey, has it felt like a roller coaster at times?
Sorry, I only laugh because, yeah, most definitely.
How
Yeah.
so? I'm curious. Like, I love to know those stories, because those are like the stories that I think like everybody, can relate to, like as a founder too. It's like, but yeah, what are some of the stories of that roller coaster experience?
I mean, we didn't raise money until this past year, real money. Like we never had a real round. I mean, just to give you an example, of over like a year ago, for example, our expenses every month were, let's say 80K, and our bank account was at like 20. So we were managing crazy expenses and bank accounts and making sure that we were paying our bills on time, but at the same time we had to like space it out because our cash flow was so crazy. We had to be extremely capital efficient to do that. And so, one or two good sales always felt like a win because we would get like an onboarding fee, which would help cover certain costs. And then every churn would feel horrible because that was revenue out the door. Um, and then, hiring and then having to like fire our first employees was always a tough one, right? People that weren't performing, and, you know, um, dealing with new HR issues or infighting, or, just everything that you have to go through as a company leader has just been ups and downs. And every time everything starts going too good, you're always like on edge, because that it can't go up and to the right forever. There's always going to be a valley, and there's always going to be a challenge that's coming up. And so, you can't get too happy while things are good, because you just know that there's going to be an issue. For example, everything was going good, and then last week, AWS went out and our product was on one of those servers. So we were out for like 8 hours, and we're just sitting there unable to do anything, blaming a bunch of people who don't even know probably AWS exists telling them, oh yeah, Amazon's broken. And they're like, well, I went to Amazon.com and I'm still able to order stuff. And you're like, yeah, well, we're not on AWS Prime. We are only on the regular AWS. Like, you know what I mean? Like so stuff like that. That was a big one. That affected us pretty heavily.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're talking about like they're going to Amazon.com. Like I could only imagine like the yeah, the tech acumen of like your target audience or like the funeral homes, like I mean, may not be kind of like traditionally like, those that would be the most sophisticated, right? And so like yeah, how do you navigate them through some of these like technical issues that you sometimes outside of your own control. So I love your response to when I asked about has it ever felt like a roller coaster. I feel like through some of these conversations, that idea of like, infusing your own personal cash flow into the company for like 3 weeks until you can like get that cash flow back out, like and doing that for like a period of 3 to 6 months, like isn't so outside the norm, right? It's like it's a lot of times, I've heard those stories more often than not. Is like that's kind of like what you do to just kind of like sustain, get through a period of time, and then you get somehow to the other side. um when you're saying like going through those before you raise kind of like an official round, that's got to be stressful, right? Like personally stressful, professionally stressful. I mean, like how do you handle that stress like outside of work and outside of knowing these things in the back of your mind? You have to have like some kind of outlet for these things. Like, is there anything you personally go to that you do to help manage the stresses of operating something that's kind of like, again, you talked about it in going through like this, undiscovered terrain almost.
I wish I had a good answer for you there. I think leaning on some of your network and knowing that they're not necessarily like they're going through some of the things that you're going through has been super helpful. Talking about it with other founders and building a network, making sure that, you know, because yeah, we never really had to like inject our own capital per se. Like we weren't writing checks to the company, but we also weren't taking salaries for extended periods of time, right? So, that's not that's like kind of it's a similar situation, right? We're making personal financial sacrifices that way. But yeah, I would say, you know, we all read TechCrunch and we all read, the next round of these massive companies, and we're like, oh well, it's kind of like that Instagram effect where we're setting unrealistic expectations of ourselves compared to what's being posted online. But, what people don't necessarily always see is the graveyard of companies that do go out of business, that don't secure funding, that had a product or did have funding and just didn't have the right product, right? Or other companies that are struggling, that aren't out there announcing massive rounds, that are still operating and still doing well for their employees and themselves. And um so yeah, I think knowing you're not alone has been really helpful. Talking to other founders, talking to portfolio companies from our investors, and making friends with the general texting around you has been immensely helpful in navigating, because it does get lonely as a founder working at a company that feels like you're failing or feels like you're not doing well.
Yeah, so having like a support system in that way helps a lot. Because I do agree with you. I mean, I do feel like, and that's part of what I think we're trying to accomplish here is like to share those stories where, to start a business at all, right? And like be able to like last and secure funding, you're already part of like that 2% club. And then, to kind of like sustain past the 3-year period, you're even a smaller percentage, club. And then to be able to like sustain to the point where you're like hitting, 10, 15, 20, 50 million in revenue. I mean, it gets smaller and smaller. And there isn't a lot of conversations around those that never make it, right? Like out of those 100, 90, some of them are going to disappear. And what happens to that? And the impact on also your mental health. And, like there's a lot of residual effects that goes along with those things. Like everybody goes in at the starting of the race, and they're at the start line, and they feel like, everybody's like supremely excited, self-motivated, right? And then it very quickly kind of like, whittles down to a handful of people. And so,
Because yeah, we never really had to like inject our own capital per se. Like we weren't writing checks to the company, but we also weren't taking salaries for extended periods of time, right? So, that's not that's like kind of it's a similar situation, right? We're making personal financial sacrifices that way. But yeah, I would say, you know, we all read TechCrunch and we all read, the next round of these massive companies, and we're like, oh well, it's kind of like that Instagram effect where we're setting unrealistic expectations of ourselves compared to what's being posted online. But, what people don't necessarily always see is the graveyard of companies that do go out of business, that don't secure funding, that had a product or did have funding and just didn't have the right product, right? Or other companies that are struggling, that aren't out there announcing massive rounds, that are still operating and still doing well for their employees and themselves. And knowing you're not alone has been really helpful. Talking to other founders, talking to portfolio companies from our investors, and making friends with the general tech scene around you has been immensely helpful in navigating, because it does get lonely as a founder working at a company that feels like you're failing or feels like you're not doing well. People don't understand the value that someone who is on call 24/7, who's willing to like do something that 99% of the world doesn't want to do. Like if someone dies, I don't really want to handle that. I don't want to like clean them up. I don't like, there's like this whole layer of things that someone is doing for you that you would never want to do yourself. But then they get a pretty bad rap because you come into these situations once or twice in your life, you don't know anything about it, and then someone's like, yeah, well, you're gonna have to pay X thousands of dollars for this, and it's hard to wrap your head around. But at the same time, it's like this person also needs to make a living. They're not there to they're the overwhelming majority, there's always bad apples in every industry, but the overwhelming majority of these funeral directors are there only to help and are extremely empathetic, and may seem like weird trying to sell you things, but at the same time they're also not salespeople. They're not trained salespeople, but that's part of their job, right? Is helping you understand what you need to take care of this funeral. And so I think oftentimes that comes off as weird when someone who's not a good salesman, like, I can totally empathize, because I was doing the same thing. I'm trying to like, I can't imagine what those early cold calls sounded like when I was making those calls, right? They're probably like, who is this person? What is this scam? What is this? But, I wasn't there trying to scam anybody. I actually had a service that I knew was valuable and that could help the people that I was calling. I just didn't know how to package it correctly, right? And I think that's what I've learned is, you go into death care with the right intentions. And it's a hard situation because no one wants to have to deal with you, right? No one wants to have to go to a funeral home. It's just not a situation it's like an uphill battle, right? It's not a situation that any consumer really wants to go through. You're not feeling great when you do talk to this person, and then this person is now, making money off of a situation that is usually horrible, right? So yeah, I think my perception of our customers and who I'm selling to has changed completely. Like I'm on the side of death care, and I do think it's unfair that, you know, I think they get a lot of unnecessary hate from, the media, and, a lot of people, the only time you'll talk about a funeral home or death care in anything is usually on a negative side. So I would definitely go against anyone and argue and say that, death care providers and funeral directors and funeral homes are there on your side. They're on your side. It's not a antagonistic relationship.
I can only imagine. Yeah, you're going into a service that nobody wants to deal with. It's an uphill battle from the moment they arrive to calling you. So very cool. I mean, on that note, I think we can wrap things up here, and I think it was really great speaking with you and understanding a lot more about this innocuous space of death care. And I think it's I think it's just super interesting how you ended up here, and it being sparked from the passing of your grandmother, and then realizing that there's got to be a better way than your consumer journey, and then seeing the different iterations of the business ultimately through the advice of investors and other mentors and advisors to then change it so that it could be something that was viable and sustainable. um if there's anything you want to say to any listeners where they should be asking for parting pro at their funeral home, or for whatever their unfortunate experience might be. But maybe there's a situation where they do not want that human interaction feel. They rather just get it done in a way that they allows their family to grieve at home and in peace without having to deal with anything else. Like, if you wanted to share a little bit more about what Parting Pro does to that audience, and then and we can leave it at that.
Sure. Yeah. So a funeral home that has Parting Pro installed, you'll be able to do almost all of the arrangement stuff, the payment, all the paperwork online. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have this human interaction. 95% of our families that you end up interacting with Parting Pro still have a relationship with the funeral director. They still call, they still will eventually come in to the funeral home, but most of the stuff that can be done virtually is now done virtually. So, paying an invoice or answering a questionnaire about your loved one, because a lot of that is just paperwork that has to be filed with the county that the funeral director does. Like, that doesn't have to be done in person. So anyone that needs to go through the situation, and anytime it starts to feel like, oh, this could have been an email, or I don't know why I'm faxing something, that's usually where Parting Pro would make it so you're not thinking about those types of things. And where if you don't know what prices are, everything within an online store is very transparent and clear what you're buying and what it costs and what it looks like. So there's no questions there. So that's really what Parting Pro is trying to do, is make everything as easy and transparent as possible, so that you don't have such a there's not a big what if when you're going through this situation.
Well, thanks again for taking the time with us. This was awesome. It was one of the, again, like the conversations that was really more excited to have, just because of the space that it's in. And it was great to just also hear more of your story, and like get to know you a little bit more about like how you ended up here. So, best of luck on the business too, and the continued growth and success, and growing your team, hopefully from 25 to 50 within the next year or so. Um,
Oof.
yeah. A whole new set of problems.
Yeah, hopefully.
But awesome. Yeah. Congrats on the success so far. And thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thanks.